When I walked into that courtroom 6 months later, clutching a manila envelope that would change everything, my husband David thought he knew exactly what was inside. He sat there with his smug smile, probably expecting me to hand over some desperate plea for a smaller alimony payment, or maybe a pathetic attempt to save our marriage. What he didn't expect was for me to calmly spread 37 photographs across that mahogany table, each one documenting a year-long conspiracy that went far beyond simple adultery. The color drained from his face as he realized that the broken woman he thought he'd left behind had become something much more dangerous. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This story really begins on the worst day of my life, when I buried my mother and came home to find another woman sleeping in my bed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days in Cleveland, as if the sky itself was mourning alongside me. I remember standing beside Mom's grave, watching the last shovelful of earth cover the simple oak casket we'd chosen together during those awful final weeks. Margaret Susan Williams, beloved mother and teacher, 1952 to 2024. The headstone would be simple, just like she'd wanted. Nothing fancy or expensive that would burden me with unnecessary debt. Even in death, Mom was still trying to take care of me. My name is Sarah Elizabeth Williams, though for the past 8 years I'd been Sarah Rodriguez, and at 34 years old, I thought I had my life figured out. I was one of Chicago's top real estate agents, consistently ranking in the top 5% for sales volume 3 years running. My business cards featured a professional headshot where I looked confident and successful, standing in front of the Chicago skyline with my arms crossed and a genuine smile. That photo was taken outside the Willis Tower after closing my biggest deal ever, a $2.8 million penthouse that netted me a commission most people don't see in 5 years. But standing there in that cemetery, none of those achievements mattered. I was just a daughter who'd lost her anchor, the woman who'd raised me single-handedly after my father decided we weren't worth staying for when I was 12. Mom had worked double shifts as a nurse to put me through college, never complained when I chose Northwestern over the state school that would have been cheaper, never questioned my dreams of building something bigger than the small Cleveland neighborhood where we'd scraped by for so many years. The funeral had been small but meaningful. Mom's colleagues from Cleveland General Hospital filled 2 pews, sharing stories about how she'd stayed late to comfort frightened patients, or covered extra shifts when someone's child was sick. Mrs. Henderson from next door brought a casserole and told me how Mom had been secretly paying for her grocery deliveries since her husband died last winter. I learned more about my mother's generosity in those 3 days than I'd known in 34 years, and it made losing her even more devastating. David should have been there beside me, holding my hand as we said goodbye to the woman who'd welcomed him into our family with open arms from the very first time I brought him home for Christmas dinner 6 years ago. Mom had loved David immediately, charmed by his easy laugh and the way he'd insisted on helping her with the dishes, rolling up his sleeves and entertaining her with stories about his construction crews, while I sat at her kitchen table grading papers from her 5th grade class. Instead, my husband had stayed behind in Chicago, claiming that someone needed to manage Rodriguez construction while I was away. The Henderson project is at a critical phase, he'd explained, kissing my forehead with what seemed like genuine sympathy. Mrs. Henderson is demanding, and if we don't stay on schedule, she'll find another contractor. You understand, right? Your mom would want me to take care of business so we can take care of you. I'd understood, or at least I'd wanted to understand. David had built his construction company from nothing, starting with small bathroom renovations and working his way up to complete home transformations that regularly appeared in Chicago Home and Garden magazine. He was proud of his reputation for quality work and on-time delivery, and I was proud of him for building something solid and respectable. We were a team, combining my real estate expertise with his construction knowledge to flip houses and build an investment portfolio that had grown to over $2 million in just 5 years. The flight from Cleveland back to Chicago gave me 3 hours to process everything that had happened. Mom's illness had been mercifully brief, but emotionally exhausting. The lung cancer diagnosis had come just 6 weeks before she died, and I'd spent every weekend flying back and forth, helping her organize her affairs, and trying to make her comfortable. David had been supportive during those weeks, encouraging me to spend as much time with her as possible and handling more of our business responsibilities so I could focus on family. As the plane descended through the clouds toward O'Hare, I could see the lights of the city where David and I had built our life together. Our Victorian house in Lincoln Park sat somewhere in that sprawling grid of streets and dreams, a complete renovation that David had personally overseen when we got married 8 years ago. He'd stripped it down to the studs and rebuilt it into something magnificent, with exposed brick walls, restored hardwood floors, and a kitchen that had been featured in a magazine spread about historical home preservation. That house represented everything we'd accomplished together. I'd found it when it was a foreclosure disaster that most buyers wouldn't even tour, seeing potential where others saw only problems. David had seen the same vision I did, and together we'd created something beautiful from something broken. It felt like a metaphor for our marriage, taking two people with complicated pasts and building something stronger together. I took a taxi from the airport, too emotionally drained to deal with parking, and too eager to be home after 3 days of grief and logistics. It was nearly 11 o'clock when we pulled onto Maple Street, and I expected to see our house dark and quiet, maybe just the porch light David always left on when I was traveling. Instead, there was a red Honda Civic parked in my spot in our driveway, and the lights were on in our bedroom window. My first thought was that David had invited his business partner Mike over to work on project plans, though it seemed strange that Mike would be driving a different car. My second thought was that maybe David had hired someone to help with paperwork while I was dealing with Mom's funeral, someone who'd stayed late to catch up on the administrative tasks I usually handled. I paid the taxi driver and wheeled my suitcase up the front walk, fishing for my keys while mentally preparing to be social with whoever David had brought over to help. The house smelled different when I opened the front door. Not bad, exactly, but unfamiliar. There was a floral perfume in the air that I didn't recognize, something expensive and sophisticated that definitely wasn't mine. I preferred simple scents, light and clean, while this was bold and unmistakably feminine. I could hear voices coming from upstairs, and one of them was definitely female, laughing at something David had said. My exhausted brain tried to process what I was hearing. David's voice, relaxed and intimate, mixed with a woman's laughter that seemed completely at home in my house. I set my suitcase down carefully and slipped off my shoes, some instinct telling me to move quietly as I tried to understand what was happening in my own home. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step on the restored hardwood that David and I had refinished together, seeming impossibly loud despite my careful movements. The voices were coming from our master bedroom, the room where we'd talked about starting a family, where David had held me while I cried about my struggles with fertility treatments, where he'd promised me that we'd figure it out together because our love was strong enough to overcome anything. The bedroom door was partially open, and through the gap I could see movement and shadows cast by the soft lamplight David preferred for evening relaxation. I heard water running in our ensuite bathroom, and David's voice humming something cheerful and completely carefree. My hand was shaking as I pushed the door open wider, already knowing what I would find, but somehow still hoping I was wrong. Jessica Miller was lying in my bed, wearing the black silk nightgown I'd bought for our anniversary last year but never had the courage to actually wear. She was young, probably mid-20s, with blonde hair spread across my pillow and a confident smile that suggested she belonged exactly where she was. When she saw me standing in the doorway, her expression shifted from contentment to shock, to something that might have been embarrassment but not guilt. Not the kind of shame I would have expected from someone caught in such an intimate betrayal. "Oh my God," she said, sitting up quickly and reaching for a robe that was definitely not mine. "Sarah, David said you weren't coming back until tomorrow." David emerged from the bathroom wearing only a towel around his waist, still humming the same tune, water droplets glistening on his shoulders. When he saw me standing there, he didn't look surprised or ashamed, or even particularly concerned. He looked annoyed, as if I'd interrupted something important rather than discovered the complete destruction of my marriage. "You're early," he said, and those 2 words contained everything I needed to know about how little my feelings mattered to him anymore. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't demand explanations or throw anything, or collapse in devastation. I just stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching my husband and his mistress scramble to figure out how to handle my unexpected return from my mother's funeral. The woman I'd just buried had raised me to be stronger than the moment demanded, and somewhere in my grief-numbed mind I could hear her voice telling me to keep my dignity intact no matter what. "I'll give you both a few minutes to get dressed," I said quietly, my voice surprisingly steady. "Then I think we need to talk." I walked back downstairs and sat at our kitchen table, the same table where David and I had planned our future together, discussed property investments, and shared thousands of meals over 8 years of marriage. The house felt foreign now, contaminated by the knowledge that while I'd been honoring my mother's memory and handling the most difficult experience of my life, my husband had been playing house with another woman. David came downstairs 15 minutes later, fully dressed and attempting to look contrite. Jessica followed behind him, wearing jeans and a sweater that definitely hadn't come from my closet. She'd obviously been staying here for more than just tonight, which meant this wasn't a spontaneous mistake, but a deliberate choice to move his mistress into our home while I was grieving. "Sarah, let me explain," David began, using the same tone he'd used to discuss a construction delay with a frustrated client. "Explain what?" I asked. "That you moved your girlfriend into our house while I was burying my mother?" "It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think, David. What I don't understand is why you couldn't wait until I got home to discuss whatever problems you think we have." Jessica shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing she could disappear. "I should probably go," she said. "No," I replied, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "You're obviously comfortable here. You might as well stay for this conversation." David tried a different approach, the reasonable one he used when he wanted to convince me to see things his way. "Look, Sarah, we've been having problems for months. You've been so focused on your mom's illness, on work, on everything except us. We've grown apart. So you decided to replace me without discussing it first?" "I'm not replacing you. Jessica is helping me realize what I want in my life going forward." The casual cruelty of that statement hit me harder than anger or shouting would have. David wasn't even pretending this was a mistake or a moment of weakness. He was presenting his betrayal as a rational business decision, as if our marriage was a failing investment he'd decided to liquidate. "What do you want in your life going forward?" I repeated. "And what exactly is that?" "I want to be with someone who appreciates what I've built, who supports my goals instead of always being distracted by other things." "Other things like my dying mother?" "That's not what I meant, but it was exactly what he meant, and we all knew it." David had resented the time and emotional energy I'd devoted to Mom's illness, had seen my grief as an inconvenience rather. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, than understanding it as the natural response to losing the most important person in my life. I looked at Jessica, who was studying her hands and clearly wishing she could be anywhere else. "How long has this been going on?" 6 months, David answered when Jessica remained silent. 6 months. That meant it had started around the time Mom was diagnosed, when I was struggling to balance caring for her with maintaining my career and marriage. While I'd been flying back and forth to Cleveland, holding Mom's hand through chemotherapy treatments that ultimately didn't work, David had been starting a relationship with his young project manager. "I see," I said. "And you moved her in when?" "Yesterday," Jessica finally spoke, "but it's not permanent. We needed to see how it felt." "How it felt?" "They'd been testing out domestic life in my house, sleeping in my bed, probably using my kitchen and living room and everything else I'd worked to create, while I was saying goodbye to my mother forever." "Well," I said, standing up from the table, "I hope it felt everything you hoped it would. I'm going to stay in the guest room tonight, and tomorrow we'll figure out next steps." David looked relieved that I wasn't screaming or threatening or making the dramatic scene he'd probably expected. "I think that's best," he said. "We can work this out like adults." I nodded and walked upstairs to the guest room, closing the door behind me and sitting on the bed that had once been meant for visitors but would now be my temporary sanctuary. Through the walls, I could hear David and Jessica talking in low voices, probably congratulating themselves on how maturely I'd handled the situation. What they didn't know was that my apparent calm wasn't acceptance or defeat. It was strategy. Mom had been a nurse for 30 years, and she taught me that in a crisis, you assess the situation before you act. You gather information, you make a plan, and then you execute it with precision and purpose. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Lisa Martinez, my college roommate who'd become a paralegal at Chen & Associates, one of Chicago's most respected family law firms. It was nearly midnight, but I sent her a text anyway. Lisa, it's Sarah. I need to talk to your boss first thing Monday morning. It's urgent. Her response came back within minutes. Everything okay? No, I typed back, but it will be. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay in the guest room bed listening to my husband and his mistress moving around in my house, planning their future while I planned mine. By morning, I knew exactly what I was going to do, and it had nothing to do with working things out like adults. David Rodriguez had made the mistake of thinking that grief had made me weak. He was about to learn that it had actually made me dangerous. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that usually energized me for another week of property showings and contract negotiations. Instead, I found myself sitting across from Martha Chen in her corner office overlooking Michigan Avenue, trying to explain how my marriage had imploded while I was grieving my mother. Martha was in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of sharp intelligence that had made her the most feared divorce attorney in Chicago. Her office walls were lined with awards and photos of her shaking hands with judges and politicians, but what impressed me most was the way she listened without judgment, as I told her about finding Jessica in my bed. "What do you want from this divorce, Sarah?" Martha asked, her pen poised over a yellow legal pad. "I want to understand what I'm dealing with first," I replied. "Then I want to make sure David doesn't get to destroy my life without consequences." Martha nodded approvingly. "Smart approach. Most women come in here so emotional they can't think strategically. First step is gathering financial records. Every bank statement, every business document, every receipt you can find. If your husband was planning this betrayal, there might be other surprises waiting." I spent the rest of that week maintaining a careful facade at home, while David and Jessica settled into what they clearly considered their new domestic arrangement. David went to work each morning as if nothing had changed, kissing Jessica goodbye at the front door while I watched from the guest room window. They cooked dinner together in my kitchen, watched television on my couch, and generally acted like I was a temporary inconvenience, rather than the woman who'd helped build everything they were now enjoying. The hardest part was pretending I didn't notice the small changes they'd made to accommodate Jessica's presence. Her skincare products lined the bathroom counter where my things used to be. Her clothes hung in the closet David and I had shared. She'd even rearranged the living room furniture, moving my grandmother's antique lamp to make space for a modern floor lamp she'd apparently brought from wherever she'd been living before. But I was learning things too. Jessica wasn't just some random affair partner David had picked up at a bar. She'd been working as Rodriguez Construction's project manager for 8 months, which meant she'd been involved in our business operations long before their personal relationship began. She knew our clients, our financial systems, our upcoming projects. She'd been inside our professional life before she invaded our personal one. During those careful days of observation, I started paying attention to conversations I'd previously ignored. When David took phone calls in the evening, supposedly discussing work issues with clients or suppliers, I noticed that many of those calls were actually with Jessica. They used business terminology, but their tone was intimate, conspiratorial. They were planning something beyond just their relationship. I also started noticing financial irregularities that I'd previously dismissed as normal business fluctuations. Our joint checking account showed regular transfers to Rodriguez Construction's business account, which wasn't unusual since I often helped with cash flow management. But there were additional transfers to an account I didn't recognize, labeled as Miller Property Management. When I casually asked David about it, he brushed off my question. "Just a new subsidiary for organizing some of our investment properties," he explained. Jessica suggested we create separate entities for different types of projects to optimize our tax situation. Jessica had suggested financial restructuring for our business. The woman who'd been sleeping with my husband had also been advising him on our money management. The professional betrayal was starting to feel as significant as the personal one. I began documenting everything with the methodical approach Mom had taught me during her years as a charge nurse. She'd always said that in complicated situations, you needed to write everything down because memory could be unreliable when emotions were involved. I started a detailed journal, noting every conversation, every financial transaction, every small detail that seemed out of place. The pattern that emerged was troubling. Over the past 8 months, since Jessica had joined Rodriguez Construction, David's behavior had changed in ways I'd attributed to business stress, but now realized were signs of his double life. He'd started working later, claiming they were behind on major projects. He'd begun taking weekend meetings with clients, supposedly to accommodate their schedules. He'd grown distant physically, attributing his lack of interest in intimacy to exhaustion from managing a growing business. Most painfully, I realized that David's decreased enthusiasm for starting a family hadn't been about timing or financial concerns, as he'd claimed. During one of their evening phone conversations that I overheard from the guest room, David told Jessica that he was, quote, looking forward to a fresh start without complications from the past. Children, apparently, would have been complications that interfered with their plans. The fertility treatments I'd been enduring for 6 months, the hormone injections that made me emotional and physically uncomfortable, the monthly disappointments when each cycle failed, the mounting medical bills that David had claimed to support enthusiastically, all of it had been meaningless to him. While I'd been hoping we could create a family together, he'd been planning to create a different family with someone else. I started researching Jessica Miller more thoroughly, using the investigative skills I'd developed through years of real estate background checks and property research. Social media profiles revealed that she'd moved to Chicago from Milwaukee about a year ago, citing, quote, new opportunities and a desire for a fresh start. Her LinkedIn profile showed previous experience with smaller construction companies, but there were gaps in her employment history that seemed deliberately vague. More interesting was what I learned about her financial situation. Jessica drove a car that cost more than most project managers could afford, wore designer clothes that seemed expensive for someone in her position, and lived in a high-end apartment complex in River North that charged rents well above what Rodriguez Construction paid her. Either she had family money or she was receiving income from sources beyond her official salary. When I mentioned these observations to Martha during our second meeting, she immediately recommended hiring a private investigator. Financial discrepancies often reveal deeper deceptions, Martha explained. If your husband has been hiding assets or creating secret income streams, we need to know before we start divorce proceedings. And if this Jessica person is involved in business fraud, that changes the entire legal landscape. Tom Walsh came highly recommended as an investigator who specialized in financial crimes and marital infidelity. He was a former Chicago police detective who'd transitioned to private work after 20 years on the force, and his no-nonsense approach reminded me of my mother's practical personality. During our first meeting at a downtown coffee shop, Tom explained how these investigations typically unfolded. Cheating spouses usually make financial mistakes, he said, stirring sugar into his black coffee. They open new accounts, make unusual purchases, change their spending patterns. If your husband has been planning this betrayal for months, there's probably a money trail that tells the real story. Tom's retainer fee was substantial, but Martha assured me it was an investment that could pay for itself if we discovered hidden assets or fraudulent activity. I authorized the investigation using money from my personal business account, funds I'd earned through my own real estate commissions that David couldn't claim or control. While Tom began his financial investigation, I continued my careful observation of David and Jessica's domestic routine. They'd settled into my house as if they'd been living together for years rather than days. Jessica had clearly been spending significant time there even before I left for Mom's funeral, because she knew where everything was located and moved through the space with complete familiarity. She'd also made herself comfortable with our social circle in ways that suggested this relationship had been developing openly while I'd been distracted by Mom's illness. When David's business partner Mike Torres called the house, Jessica answered and chatted with him as if they'd spoken many times before. When our neighbor Mrs. Patterson stopped by to drop off a casserole and offer condolences about my mother, Jessica introduced herself as David's partner, without specifying whether she meant business or personal. The most painful discovery came when I was looking through our home office for financial documents Martha had requested. In David's desk drawer, underneath a stack of construction invoices, I found a manila folder labeled Future Planning. Inside were printouts from real estate websites showing luxury condominiums for sale in downtown Chicago, all of them featuring 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom layouts perfect for a couple without children. The dates on the printouts went back 4 months, to June, which meant David had been planning to leave our marriage since early summer. While I'd been focused on Mom's declining health and trying to maintain both my career and our relationship, David had been methodically planning his exit strategy. But the most damning evidence in that folder was a handwritten note in David's distinctive scrawl. J's ideas for minimizing S's claim to business assets. Jessica hadn't just been advising David on our tax structure. She'd been helping him figure out how to divorce me while protecting as much of our joint wealth as possible. That night, after David and Jessica had gone to bed in what used to be my bedroom, I sat in the guest room reviewing everything I'd learned. The affair was just the visible part of a much larger betrayal that involved our business, our finances, and our entire future. David hadn't just fallen for another woman. He'd systematically planned to replace me in every aspect of his life, while using my own money and trust to facilitate the transition. I thought about calling my sister in Denver, the one family member I had left now that Mom was gone. Rebecca had always been skeptical of David, claiming he was too charming and confident for his own good. Men who seem too perfect usually are hiding something, she'd warned me years ago. I dismissed her concerns as jealousy over my successful marriage, but now I wondered if she'd seen something I'd missed. Instead of calling Rebecca, I texted Tom Walsh with a simple message. I need this investigation expedited. I think the fraud goes deeper than we initially suspected. His response came back within minutes. Already on it. Found some interesting discrepancies in the business accounts. Let's meet tomorrow. I also sent Martha a message requesting an emergency consultation to discuss accelerating our legal strategy. Whatever David and Jessica were planning, I needed to stay ahead of them. The grieving widow they thought they were manipulating was about to become their worst nightmare. The next morning, David left for work early, claiming he had a client breakfast meeting. Jessica lingered over coffee in my kitchen, reading emails on her phone with the casual comfort of someone who belonged there permanently. When she noticed me watching her, she attempted a friendly smile. "Sarah, I know this situation is awkward for everyone," she said, as if we were discussing a minor scheduling conflict rather than the destruction of my marriage. David and I never intended for things to happen this way. How exactly did you intend for things to happen? I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. We tried to fight our feelings for months. But sometimes people just connect in ways that can't be ignored. David's been unhappy for a long time, even if he didn't want to admit it. The casual rewriting of history was breathtaking. According to Jessica's version, she and David were star-crossed lovers who'd tried to resist their inevitable attraction, rather than a boss and employee who'd conducted a calculated affair while his wife was dealing with her mother's terminal illness. And you think moving into his house while his wife was at her mother's funeral was the mature way to handle those feelings? Jessica had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. The timing wasn't ideal, but David felt like it was important for us to see if we could build a real life together before he made any major decisions about the marriage. So this is a trial run? You're both testing out whether you want to make this permanent? I suppose you could put it that way. How's it going so far? Jessica's smile became more confident. Better than either of us expected. We work well together, both professionally and personally. David's excited about the future in ways he hasn't been for years. The conversation was surreal, discussing my husband's enthusiasm for his new relationship as if I were a neutral observer, rather than the woman being replaced. But Jessica's casual admission that they'd been working together professionally in ways that excited David gave me another piece of the puzzle I was assembling. What kind of professional projects are you working on together? I asked. Oh, expanding the business, exploring new investment opportunities, streamlining our operational efficiency. David has so many brilliant ideas for growth, and I think I bring a fresh perspective to implementation. Our operational efficiency. Jessica was already thinking of Rodriguez Construction as our business rather than David's company. And investment opportunities suggested they were using business resources for projects I knew nothing about. That afternoon, I met Tom Walsh at his office in a nondescript building near the courthouse. His desk was covered with financial printouts, bank statements, and photographs that made my stomach clench with anxiety. "Your husband has been busy," Tom said without preamble. "Miller Property Management isn't just a subsidiary for tax purposes. It's a completely separate business entity that's been acquiring real estate using funds transferred from Rodriguez construction accounts." He spread out a series of bank statements showing the money trail. "Over the past 8 months, approximately $180,000 has been moved from your joint business accounts to Miller Property Management. That money was then used to purchase 3 residential properties in emerging neighborhoods on the south side." 3 properties? What kind of properties? Foreclosure auctions, mostly. Properties that needed significant renovation work, which was then performed using materials and labor charged to Rodriguez Construction but never billed to any legitimate client. Tom showed me photographs of the properties, all of them small single-family homes in neighborhoods where property values were rising rapidly. They bought low, renovated using your business resources, and then sold high. 2 of the 3 have already been sold for substantial profits that went directly to Miller Property Management accounts controlled by Jessica Miller. The scope of the fraud was staggering. David and Jessica hadn't just been having an affair. They'd been running a parallel business using my money, my husband's expertise, and our company's resources to generate profits that I'd never seen or benefited from. "There's more," Tom continued. "Miller Property Management was incorporated 11 months ago, which means they were planning this operation before their personal relationship officially began. This wasn't a romantic impulse that led to business collaboration. This was a business fraud that included a personal relationship as part of the cover story. 11 months ago, I'd been focused on expanding my real estate client base and dealing with Mom's initial health concerns. David had seemed supportive of my increased work schedule and my frequent trips to Cleveland, encouraging me to prioritize my career and family obligations while he handled more of our business operations. I thought he was being a supportive husband. Instead, he'd been creating space for his criminal activities. "How much money are we talking about total?" I asked. "Based on the property sales I can trace, Miller Property Management has generated approximately $320,000 in profit over the past 8 months. That's money that should have been reported as Rodriguez construction income and shared with you as part of your joint business assets." Tom slid another document across his desk. "There's also this. Jessica Miller has been receiving 2 separate payments from Rodriguez Construction each month. Her official salary as project manager and a consulting fee paid to Miller Property Management for strategic planning services. Jessica had been double-dipping, receiving both a salary and consulting payments from our business while helping David steal from our joint accounts. The woman who'd been sleeping in my bed had also been systematically robbing me for months." "What do you recommend for next steps?" I asked. "Document everything, preserve all evidence, and coordinate with your attorney to determine whether you want to pursue criminal charges or handle this through civil litigation. But, Sarah, you should know that this level of financial fraud suggests they're planning something bigger. People don't go to this much trouble for a short-term scheme." Tom's warning proved prophetic when I returned home that evening to find David and Jessica celebrating with champagne in my living room. They'd obviously received good news about something, and their excitement was palpable. "What's the occasion?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Just some business success," David replied. "The Henderson project came in under budget and ahead of schedule. Mrs. Henderson is recommending us to her friends, which could mean several new contracts. I knew from Tom's investigation that there was no Henderson project, which meant David was celebrating the success of his fraudulent operation while lying directly to my face. The casual cruelty of it was stunning, but I managed to smile and offer congratulations before retreating to the guest room. That night, I lay awake thinking about the woman who'd raised me and the lessons she'd taught me about standing up for yourself when people tried to take advantage of your kindness. Mom had worked in hospitals for 30 years, dealing with doctors who tried to take credit for her ideas, administrators who undervalued nursing staff, and patients who treated her like a servant rather than a medical professional. The secret to handling bullies, she'd told me once, is to remember that their strength comes from your willingness to be intimidated. Once you stop being afraid of them, they lose their power over you. David thought his betrayal had left me powerless, devastated, and dependent on his financial generosity to survive our divorce. Jessica thought she'd won some kind of competition for David's affections and business partnership. They were both about to learn that grief had made me focused rather than fragile, and that underestimating a woman who'd lost everything she cared about was a dangerous mistake. The next morning, I called Martha Chen and scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon. It was time to stop gathering evidence and start using it. Martha Chen's office felt different during our emergency meeting that Thursday afternoon. The autumn light streaming through her floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across the conference table where Tom Walsh had spread out his investigation findings like pieces of a complex puzzle. The financial documents, bank statements, and property records painted a picture of systematic deception that went far beyond a simple extramarital affair. "This changes everything," Martha said, examining the Miller Property Management Incorporation papers with the focused intensity of a surgeon studying an X-ray. "We're not dealing with a cheating husband who made some poor decisions. This is organized financial fraud that's been operating for almost a year." Tom leaned back in his chair, his weathered face grim. The sophistication level suggests they had professional help setting this up. Someone with legal or accounting expertise advised them on structuring these transactions to avoid immediate detection. I felt a chill run down my spine as the implications became clear. David and Jessica hadn't stumbled into this scheme through passion or impulse. They'd carefully planned every aspect of their operation, which meant other people had been involved in betraying me long before I'd discovered the affair. "Who else knows about this?" I asked. "That's what we need to find out," Martha replied. "Tom, I want you to expand the investigation. Look into everyone who had access to Rodriguez Construction's financial systems. Sarah, I need you to think carefully about any accountants, lawyers, or business advisors who've worked with your company recently." The drive home from Martha's office gave me time to process what I'd learned and consider who might have been complicit in David's schemes. Rodriguez Construction used Kellerman and Associates for accounting services, the same firm that had handled our taxes for 5 years. Bob Kellerman himself managed our account, and I'd always trusted him completely. He'd helped us structure our property investments, advised us on tax strategies, and even recommended the incorporation structure we'd used when David decided to formalize his construction business. But now I wondered if Bob's advice had been designed to benefit us equally, or if he'd been positioning our assets in ways that would make them easier for David to claim during a divorce. The business structure that Bob had recommended put most of our property investments under Rodriguez Construction's name rather than joint ownership, which would give David significant advantages in any asset division. I also thought about Rodriguez Construction's lawyer, Patricia Manning, who'd handled our business contracts and incorporation paperwork. Patricia had always seemed professional and competent, but she'd also insisted on meeting with David alone for most legal consultations, claiming that business law was too complex for non-lawyers to understand effectively. At the time, I'd appreciated her efficiency and hadn't questioned the exclusion. Now I wondered if those private meetings had involved discussions about protecting David's interests at my expense. When I arrived home, David and Jessica were in the kitchen preparing dinner together, with the comfortable familiarity of a couple who'd been sharing domestic responsibilities for months rather than weeks. Jessica was chopping vegetables while David seasoned chicken, and they moved around each other in the space with practiced coordination that must have developed during the many evenings they'd spent together while I was in Cleveland, caring for Mom. "How was your day?" David asked with the casual tone of a husband making polite conversation, as if our current living arrangement was perfectly normal. "Productive," I replied. "I met with some professional advisors about handling Mom's estate and getting my own finances organized." "Good idea," Jessica chimed in. "It's important for women to understand their financial position, especially during transitions." The irony of receiving financial advice from the woman who'd been stealing from me was almost overwhelming, but I managed to nod thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right. I've learned so much about money management that I never paid attention to before." David seemed pleased by what he interpreted as my acceptance of our situation. "I'm glad you're being practical about this, Sarah. A lot of women let emotions cloud their judgment during divorces." Oh, I'm definitely keeping my emotions in check, I assured him. I want to make sure I understand exactly what I'm entitled to before I make any decisions. That evening, after David and Jessica had retired to my former bedroom, I sat in the guest room with my laptop and began researching everyone who'd had professional relationships with Rodriguez Construction over the past year. What I discovered made my stomach turn with a combination of anger and betrayal that went beyond anything David and Jessica had done to me personally. Bob Kellerman's accounting firm had recently incorporated several new business entities for clients in the construction industry, all of them following the same pattern as Miller Property Management. Shell companies designed to hold real estate investments while minimizing tax obligations and protecting assets from potential litigation. The structure wasn't illegal, but it suggested that Bob had been providing similar advice to multiple clients who wanted to hide assets from their spouses. More troubling was what I found when I searched for Patricia Manning's recent legal work. She'd handled 3 divorce cases in the past year, where construction company owners had successfully argued that their business assets weren't subject to equitable distribution because they'd been structured as separate corporate entities. In each case, the wives had received minimal settlements while the husbands retained control of valuable business operations. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. David hadn't just been planning to leave me. He'd been working with professionals who specialized in helping men divorce their wives while protecting their wealth. This wasn't a spontaneous decision driven by his feelings for Jessica. This was a calculated business strategy that treated our marriage as a liability to be eliminated as efficiently as possible. I called Tom Walsh early the next morning, before David left for work, and shared what I'd discovered about our professional advisors. "I'm not surprised," Tom said grimly. "Kellerman's name has come up in other investigations. He's developed a reputation for helping business owners restructure their assets before filing for divorce. It's technically legal, but ethically questionable." "What about Patricia Manning?" "She's more careful about maintaining plausible deniability, but her track record speaks for itself. 3 successful cases in 12 months, where wives got screwed in construction industry divorces? That's not luck. That's expertise." Tom paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Sarah, there's something else you need to know. I've been monitoring David's communications, and yesterday he had a lengthy phone conversation with someone at First National Bank about refinancing options for Rodriguez Construction." "Refinancing for what purpose?" "That's what worries me. If David's planning to take out loans against the business assets, he could saddle Rodriguez Construction with debt that would reduce its value for divorce settlement purposes. Basically, he'd be borrowing against properties you helped pay for, then claiming the business is worth less because it carries more debt." The sophistication of David's financial manipulation was staggering. He wasn't just stealing from me, he was systematically destroying the value of our joint assets to minimize what I could claim in a divorce settlement. Every day I allowed this situation to continue, he was probably implementing new strategies to protect his interests while undermining mine. "How quickly can we stop this?" I asked. "Martha needs to file for emergency injunctive relief to freeze all business assets pending divorce proceedings, but that will tip our hand and let David know we're onto his schemes. I'm tired of pretending I don't know what's happening. File whatever paperwork you need to file." That afternoon, while David was supposedly meeting with clients and Jessica was at the Rodriguez Construction office managing what she called operational improvements, I met with Martha to sign the legal documents that would transform me from a passive victim into an active participant in my own divorce. The emergency motion requested immediate court intervention to prevent David from transferring, selling, or encumbering any assets that might be subject to equitable distribution. It also requested a forensic accounting of all Rodriguez Construction financial transactions over the past year, which would expose the Miller Property Management scheme and David's collaboration with Jessica. "Once we file this, everything changes," Martha warned me. "David will know that you're not the grieving, overwhelmed widow he thinks he's been managing. Are you prepared for his reaction?" "I'm prepared for whatever comes next," I replied, signing my name with the steady hand Mom had taught me to maintain during difficult moments. Martha filed the motion that afternoon, and the court scheduled an emergency hearing for the following Monday. David would be served with papers over the weekend, which meant I had approximately 48 hours to prepare for his response to learning that his carefully planned scheme had been discovered. I spent Friday evening acting as normal as possible, making polite conversation with David and Jessica while internally bracing for the storm that was coming. They seemed relaxed and confident, probably congratulating themselves on how smoothly their transition was proceeding. David even suggested that we should start discussing the practical details of our separation, such as how to divide household belongings and coordinate schedules for moving our lives apart. I think we should try to keep this as amicable as possible, he said, using the reasonable tone that had always been effective in getting me to see things his way. Lawyers and court battles just make everything more expensive and complicated for everyone. I agree completely, I replied. I want this to be as straightforward as possible. Jessica nodded approvingly. That's such a mature approach. A lot of people let pride get in the way of practical solutions. Saturday morning brought an early knock on our front door, and I watched from the guest room window as a process server handed David the legal documents that would shatter his illusion of control. Even from upstairs, I could see his body language change as he read the motion for emergency injunctive relief and realized that his financial activities had been discovered and documented. His voice carried up the stairs as he called for Jessica, and I could hear them talking in urgent, worried tones in the kitchen. Within an hour, David was on the phone with Patricia Manning, probably learning that her carefully structured asset protection strategies were about to be exposed in court proceedings. The house felt different after David received those papers, charged with tension and barely suppressed anger that reminded me of the atmosphere before severe thunderstorms. David's polite facade disappeared completely, replaced by the cold calculation of a man whose plans had been disrupted by an opponent he'd underestimated. We need to talk, he said when I came downstairs for coffee Saturday afternoon. Of course. What's on your mind? Don't play innocent with me, Sarah. You hired investigators and lawyers without discussing it with me first. That's not the cooperative approach we agreed on. We never agreed on anything, David. You moved your girlfriend into our house while I was burying my mother, and then you told me you wanted a divorce. I don't recall agreeing to cooperate with my own destruction. This is exactly the kind of vindictive response I was hoping we could avoid. Vindictive? I'm protecting my legal rights in a marriage that you've been systematically looting for almost a year. That's not vindictive, that's intelligent. Jessica appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face pale and worried. David, maybe we should call Patricia again. Sarah obviously has lawyers giving her bad advice about making this adversarial. My lawyers are giving me excellent advice about protecting assets that I helped create from a husband who's been stealing from me while planning our divorce, I replied calmly. David's mask slipped completely, revealing the anger and contempt he'd been hiding behind his reasonable demeanor. You have no idea what you're doing, Sarah. You think hiring some hotshot attorney makes you powerful, but you're just embarrassing yourself. I built Rodriguez Construction. I made the business decisions. I took the risks. You handled paperwork and wrote checks. I also provided the initial capital, managed all financial planning, and spent 3 years building the client relationships that made your business successful. But more importantly, I didn't commit fraud or theft, which gives me a significant advantage in legal proceedings. Fraud? You're delusional if you think Miller Property Management represents fraud. It's a legitimate business entity that I'm allowed to operate independently. Using funds transferred from our joint business accounts without my knowledge or consent to purchase properties that were renovated with materials charged to Rodriguez Construction but never billed to legitimate clients. Your lawyer can explain why that constitutes fraud. The fact that I knew specific details about his schemes clearly shocked David. He'd assumed I was operating on suspicion and emotion rather than documented evidence and professional legal advice. How long have you been spying on me? He demanded. I've been protecting myself since the night I came home from Mom's funeral and found your girlfriend in my bed. Every financial transaction, every property transfer, every consulting payment to Miller Property Management is documented and will be presented to the court Monday morning. Jessica sank into a kitchen chair, the reality of their situation finally penetrating her confidence. David, you said the business structure was completely legal. You said there wouldn't be any problems. It is legal, David snapped, but his certainty had evaporated. Sarah's lawyers are just trying to intimidate us with aggressive tactics. The court will determine what's legal and what constitutes fraud, I said, along with what constitutes equitable distribution of marital assets. and whether Jessica's involvement in financial crimes makes her liable for damages. That last point hit Jessica like a physical blow. Whatever David had told her about the legal risks of their scheme, he'd clearly minimized the possibility that she could face personal liability for participating in financial fraud. "I need to call my own lawyer," Jessica said quietly. "Good idea," I agreed. "You'll probably want someone who specializes in white-collar criminal defense rather than family law." David spent the rest of Saturday making increasingly frantic phone calls to Patricia Manning, Bob Kellerman, and several other people whose names I didn't recognize, but whose involvement suggested the network of professionals facilitating his schemes was larger than I'd initially suspected. Each conversation seemed to leave him more agitated and less confident about his position. By Sunday evening, the atmosphere in the house had become so toxic that Jessica announced she was staying at a hotel until the legal situation was resolved. Her departure felt like a small victory, evidence that the confident partnership David thought he'd built was already showing cracks under legal pressure. "This isn't over, Sarah," David warned me as Jessica packed her bags. "You might have surprised me with your little investigation, but I'm not going to let you destroy everything I've worked to build." "I'm not destroying anything, David. I'm just making sure the court understands what you've already destroyed and who's responsible for the damage." That night, alone in the guest room for the first time since I'd returned from Mom's funeral, I allowed myself to feel a moment of satisfaction about how completely I'd outmaneuvered the people who'd thought they could manipulate me with impunity. David had spent months planning his betrayal while assuming I was too distracted and emotional to notice his schemes. Tomorrow's court hearing would determine how much of our joint assets David would be allowed to keep, and whether his financial crimes would result in criminal charges in addition to civil penalties. But regardless of the specific outcomes, I'd already accomplished something important. I'd proven that underestimating a grieving woman was a mistake that carried serious consequences. The woman who'd buried her mother while her husband celebrated with his mistress was gone forever. In her place was someone much more dangerous, a woman who'd lost everything she cared about and now had nothing left to lose. Monday morning arrived with the kind of sharp November cold that cuts through even the best winter coats, and I found myself standing outside the Cook County Courthouse, feeling more prepared than I'd ever felt in my life. Martha Chen stood beside me, her briefcase heavy with evidence that would reshape David's understanding of his own situation, while Tom Walsh reviewed his final investigative notes on the courthouse steps. "Remember," Martha said as we climbed the granite steps toward the main entrance, "today is about establishing the facts and securing temporary protections. The real work begins after we have court orders preventing further asset transfers." Inside the courthouse, the Family Law Division buzzed with the quiet efficiency of a system designed to handle other people's broken relationships and financial disputes. I'd never imagined I'd be sitting in one of these sterile rooms, presenting evidence of my husband's betrayal to a judge who would determine the financial future I'd be allowed to build from the wreckage of my marriage. David arrived 20 minutes before our scheduled hearing, flanked by Patricia Manning and another attorney I didn't recognize, a tall man in an expensive suit who carried himself with the arrogance of someone accustomed to winning through intimidation rather than facts. Jessica wasn't with them, which suggested she'd taken my advice about hiring criminal defense representation seriously. When David saw me across the courtroom waiting area, his expression was a mixture of anger and calculation that reminded me of a chess player who'd discovered his opponent had been planning several moves ahead while he'd been focused on immediate tactics. He whispered something to Patricia Manning, who nodded and made notes on her legal pad with the focused intensity of someone preparing for battle. Judge Helen Morrison called our case at exactly 9:30, and we filed into her courtroom with the formal precision of opposing armies taking their positions. Judge Morrison had a reputation for impatience with lawyers who wasted her time and zero tolerance for litigants who attempted to hide assets during divorce proceedings. Martha had specifically requested Judge Morrison because of her track record in complex financial cases. "This is an emergency motion for injunctive relief," Judge Morrison began, reviewing the paperwork Martha had filed. "Mrs. Rodriguez is requesting immediate court intervention to prevent further transfer or encumbrance of marital assets. Mr. Rodriguez, you've had an opportunity to review these allegations?" Patricia Manning stood to respond. "Your Honor, my client disputes the characterization of his legitimate business activities as fraudulent asset transfers. Rodriguez Construction is a successful enterprise that requires ongoing operational flexibility to serve clients effectively. Mrs. Chen, please present your evidence. Martha rose with the calm confidence of an attorney who'd spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment. Your Honor, we have documentary evidence that Mr. Rodriguez has systematically transferred marital assets to a shell corporation controlled by his paramour for the purpose of converting joint property to separate assets outside his wife's reach. The next hour unfolded like a perfectly choreographed performance, as Martha presented bank statements, property records, and incorporation documents that painted an undeniable picture of David's fraudulent schemes. Tom Walsh's investigation had been thorough enough to trace every dollar from our joint accounts through Miller Property Management to the purchase and sale of properties that had generated hundreds of thousands in profits David had never reported. Judge Morrison's expression grew increasingly stern as she reviewed the evidence. Mr. Rodriguez, Miller Property Management was incorporated 11 months ago, using funds transferred from Rodriguez Construction accounts. These transferred funds represent approximately 40% of your company's available capital during that period. How do you explain these transactions? David's new attorney, who'd introduced himself as Richard Blackwood, attempted to minimize the significance of the financial transfers. Your Honor, Miller Property Management represents a legitimate business expansion designed to optimize Mr. Rodriguez's investment portfolio and tax obligations. The timing was driven by market opportunities rather than marital considerations. Market opportunities, Judge Morrison repeated dryly. Mr. Blackwood, are you seriously arguing that your client's decision to incorporate a real estate investment company controlled by his girlfriend 11 months ago was unrelated to his marital situation? The personal relationship between Mr. Rodriguez and Ms. Miller developed after the business entity was established for legitimate commercial purposes. Martha stood again, holding a thick folder of documents. Your Honor, we have text message records and email communications, proving that Mr. Rodriguez and Ms. Miller were discussing both their personal relationship and their property investment schemes as early as March of this year. The business fraud and the extramarital affair were coordinated activities, not separate decisions. Judge Morrison accepted the communications evidence and spent several minutes reviewing text messages that Tom's investigation had recovered from David's phone records. The silence in the courtroom was profound as she read conversations where David and Jessica had planned both their romantic relationship and their property investments with equal calculation. Mr. Rodriguez, Judge Morrison said finally, these communications indicate that you and Ms. Miller were discussing ways to, quote, minimize Sarah's claim to business assets as early as June. Would you like to explain this language? David's face had gone completely pale, and I could see him struggling to find an explanation that wouldn't make his situation worse. Your Honor, those conversations were taken out of context. I was simply exploring my legal options regarding potential divorce proceedings. By transferring marital assets to accounts controlled by your girlfriend? The transfers were legitimate business transactions. Mr. Rodriguez, I've reviewed construction industry practices for 15 years, and I've never seen a legitimate business case for transferring operational capital to shell corporations controlled by employees with whom the business owner is having extramarital affairs. Richard Blackwood attempted to redirect the conversation toward technical legal arguments about corporate structures and asset classifications, but Judge Morrison cut him off with the impatience of someone who'd seen these tactics too many times to be impressed. Mr. Blackwood, your client has systematically transferred marital assets to avoid equitable distribution. The sophistication of the scheme suggests premeditation and professional assistance. I'm granting Mrs. Rodriguez's motion for injunctive relief effective immediately. The court order Judge Morrison issued was more comprehensive than I dared to hope. All Rodriguez construction accounts were frozen pending forensic accounting review. David was prohibited from transferring, selling, or encumbering any assets that might be subject to equitable distribution. Miller Property Management was placed under court supervision, with all accounts frozen and a receiver appointed to review transactions and recover assets that belonged to the marital estate. Most satisfying of all, Judge Morrison ordered David to immediately restore all funds transferred to Miller Property Management, plus interest and penalties, to Rodriguez construction accounts, where they would be available for equitable distribution during divorce proceedings. Mr. Rodriguez, Judge Morrison concluded, if you attempt to violate any provision of this order, you will be held in contempt of court and face potential criminal charges for obstruction of justice. Mrs. Rodriguez's attorneys will prepare a comprehensive asset inventory, and you will cooperate fully with their forensic accounting efforts. Outside the courthouse, Martha and Tom were both smiling with the satisfaction of professionals who'd executed a perfect legal strategy. David and his attorneys had left immediately after the hearing, probably to discuss damage control strategies and potential criminal exposure. What happens next? I asked as we walked toward the parking garage. David has 30 days to comply with the asset restoration order, Martha explained. During that time, our forensic accountants will review every Rodriguez construction transaction for the past 2 years to identify additional transfers or hidden assets. If David has been running other schemes we haven't discovered yet, we'll find them. And Jessica? That depends on whether she cooperates with our investigation or continues to claim she was an innocent victim of David's manipulation. The evidence suggests she was an active participant in financial fraud, which carries serious criminal exposure. Tom handed me a business card for a certified public accountant who specialized in forensic financial investigations. Linda Morrison is the best in the business at unraveling complex asset hiding schemes. She'll work with Martha's team to make sure we recover every dollar David tried to steal. The drive home to Lincoln Park felt like traveling through a different city than the one I'd known for 8 years. The house David and I had renovated together was still beautiful, but it no longer represented our shared dreams and accomplishments. Now it was simply a valuable asset that would be divided according to legal formulas rather than emotional attachment. David's car wasn't in the driveway when I arrived, which meant he was probably meeting with his lawyers or trying to contact Jessica to coordinate their response to the court's devastating ruling. I used my key to enter the house that would soon be sold as part of our divorce settlement, thinking about how strange it felt to be alone in a space that had been invaded by so much deception. The guest room where I'd been sleeping felt temporary and depressing, so I decided to reclaim the master bedroom that David and Jessica had been using. I stripped the bed completely, washing every piece of fabric that had been contaminated by their presence, and then I opened all the windows to air out the lingering traces of Jessica's expensive perfume. While the laundry was running, I called my sister Rebecca in Denver to update her on the legal proceedings and let her know that her suspicions about David had been completely vindicated. I knew something was wrong with that man, Rebecca said, with the satisfaction of someone whose warnings had been ignored, but ultimately proven correct. No husband is that supportive of his wife spending time away from home unless he's planning to use that time for his own purposes. You tried to warn me, and I didn't listen. You were dealing with Mom's illness and trying to save your marriage. I don't blame you for wanting to believe David was the man he pretended to be. Rebecca offered to fly to Chicago to provide moral support during the divorce proceedings, but I declined her generous offer. I need to handle this myself, I explained. David spent months assuming I was too weak and distracted to protect my own interests. I want to prove that assumption was his biggest mistake. Over the next 3 weeks, Linda Morrison's forensic investigation uncovered additional financial irregularities that made David's Miller property management scheme look like amateur hour compared to his other criminal activities. He'd been inflating construction costs on legitimate client projects and pocketing the difference through fake vendor invoices. He'd been claiming business tax deductions for personal expenses by categorizing them as client entertainment or professional development. He'd even been stealing from his own employees by underreporting their hours to avoid paying proper overtime compensation. The scope of David's criminal behavior was staggering, but what shocked me most was learning how many people had known about his activities without reporting them. Bob Kellerman had been helping David structure fake business expenses for tax evasion purposes. Patricia Manning had been advising David on legal strategies for protecting stolen assets during divorce proceedings. Even some of David's construction workers had known about the inflated invoices and fake vendor payments, but had kept quiet because David paid them well for their discretion. Your husband was running a criminal enterprise that involved multiple forms of fraud, tax evasion, and theft, Linda Morrison explained during one of our weekly progress meetings. The total amount of money he's stolen from clients, employees, tax authorities, and you personally exceeds $600,000. Linda's investigation also revealed why David had been so confident about his ability to minimize my divorce settlement. He'd been planning to declare Rodriguez Construction bankrupt immediately after our divorce was finalized, claiming that business debts exceeded assets and leaving me with worthless stock in a failed company. Meanwhile, all the real value had been transferred to Miller Property Management and other shell corporations that I would have no legal claim to recover. It's actually brilliant in a completely evil way, Martha observed during one of our strategy sessions. David would have emerged from your divorce with minimal financial obligations while retaining control of substantial assets through entities you didn't know existed. The criminal investigation that followed Linda's forensic accounting discoveries moved quickly once federal authorities became involved. David's tax evasion and wire fraud violations fell under federal jurisdiction, which meant he was facing potential prison time rather than just civil penalties. Jessica's cooperation with federal investigators probably saved her from serious criminal charges, but it destroyed any remaining relationship she might have had with David. She provided detailed testimony about their property investment schemes, their plans to bankrupt Rodriguez Construction, and David's threats against anyone who might expose his criminal activities. The federal indictment against David was unsealed on a Thursday morning in December, exactly 2 months after I'd returned from Mom's funeral to find Jessica in my bed. David was arrested at the Rodriguez Construction office in front of his employees and several clients. A public humiliation that perfectly suited the man who thought he could destroy my life without consequences. David's criminal trial was scheduled for the following spring, but his divorce case moved forward immediately once he agreed to a settlement that gave me 85% of our legitimate marital assets, plus full compensation for his theft and fraud. The total settlement amount exceeded $1.8 million, enough to ensure my financial security and fund the real estate investment company I was planning to start. The Victorian house in Lincoln Park sold quickly to a young couple who reminded me of David and myself 8 years earlier, full of optimism about the future they were planning to build together. I used part of the proceeds to buy a downtown penthouse with views of Lake Michigan and enough space for the home office I'd need to manage my new business ventures. 6 months after the worst night of my life, I was featured on the cover of Chicago Business Journal as Entrepreneur of the Year for my innovative approach to residential real estate investment. The article focused on how I transformed personal adversity into professional opportunity, but it didn't mention the specific details of David's criminal activities or the financial fraud that had inadvertently provided the capital for my business expansion. David pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges and was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. His construction license was permanently revoked, and he was ordered to pay restitution to the clients and employees he'd stolen from. Patricia Manning and Bob Kellerman both faced professional sanctions and criminal charges for their roles in facilitating David's schemes. Jessica moved back to Milwaukee after testifying against David, reportedly working for her father's small construction company and keeping a much lower profile than she'd maintained during her brief time as David's partner in crime. She sent me a letter during David's sentencing hearing, apologizing for her role in destroying my marriage and expressing regret about the pain she'd helped cause. I never responded to Jessica's apology letter, not because I was holding on to anger or resentment, but because forgiveness felt irrelevant to the new life I was building. David and Jessica belonged to a chapter of my story that had ended completely, and I was more interested in writing new chapters than revisiting old ones. The real estate investment firm I founded, Williams Property Group, specialized in helping women who'd lost assets through divorce fraud to rebuild their financial security through property investment. My first client was a teacher whose contractor husband had stolen her inheritance to fund his gambling addiction. My second was a nurse whose accountant ex-husband had hidden their retirement savings in offshore accounts. By the end of my first year in business, I was managing investment portfolios for 37 women who'd survived financial betrayal and decided to take control of their own economic futures. Standing in my new office overlooking Michigan Avenue 1 year after Mom's funeral, I thought about the conversation we'd had during her final weeks about the importance of refusing to be defeated by people who underestimate your strength. David had assumed that grief and shock would make me vulnerable to manipulation, but he'd completely misjudged the woman Mom had raised me to become. The phone on my desk rang with a call from a potential new client, another woman who'd discovered her husband's financial betrayal and needed help rebuilding her life from carefully hidden assets. As I answered the call and began discussing investment strategies and legal protections, I realized that David's cruelest betrayal had inadvertently given me the greatest gift of my adult life: the knowledge that I was strong enough to survive anything and smart enough to turn survival into success. The woman who'd buried her mother while her husband celebrated with his mistress was gone forever. But the woman who'd emerged from that betrayal was someone Mom would have been proud to know. Someone who understood that the best revenge against people who try to destroy you is building something beautiful from the wreckage they leave behind. The Chicago winter that followed David's sentencing was the harshest in 20 years, but I found myself thriving in ways I'd never expected during those months of bitter cold and endless snow. My penthouse apartment on the 40th floor of a downtown high-rise had floor-to-ceiling windows that offered spectacular views of Lake Michigan, and I spent many evenings watching the lake freeze and thaw with the same patient determination I was applying to rebuilding my entire existence. Williams Property Group had grown from a personal mission to help women recover from financial betrayal into a legitimate investment firm managing over $15 million in assets for clients across Illinois and Wisconsin. What had started as my attempt to create security for myself had evolved into something much more significant: a business that specialized in helping women who'd survived economic abuse build wealth and independence through strategic real estate investments. My office on the 32nd floor of the Willis Tower was nothing like the cramped home office I'd shared with David during our marriage. The space featured custom millwork, Italian leather furniture, and original artwork by local artists whose careers I'd begun supporting as part of my commitment to investing in Chicago's creative community. The wall behind my desk displayed my real estate license, my MBA from Northwestern that I'd finally completed through evening classes, and a photograph of Mom taken during her last Christmas, when she was still healthy enough to travel and had spent 2 weeks with us in Lincoln Park. The most meaningful addition to my office was a handwritten letter from my first client, Maria Santos, framed beside my desk, where I could see it every day. Maria had been a high school mathematics teacher whose contractor husband had stolen her father's life insurance money to fund a cocaine addiction she'd known nothing about. When she'd filed for divorce, she'd discovered that their house was mortgaged beyond its value, their business accounts were empty, and her retirement savings had been liquidated to pay gambling debts. Maria's letter, written on school district letterhead in her careful teacher's handwriting, described how the real estate investments we'd made together had not only replaced her stolen savings, but had generated enough passive income to allow her to retire early and volunteer with literacy programs in underserved communities. "You didn't just help me recover financially," she'd written. "You helped me discover strength I didn't know I possessed." That sentiment echoed through dozens of similar letters from clients whose lives had been transformed by the combination of strategic investment advice and emotional support that Williams Property Group provided. Unlike traditional financial services firms that focused exclusively on maximizing returns, my company understood that women recovering from financial abuse needed more than investment strategies. They needed validation, encouragement, and proof that their survival instincts could be transformed into prosperity. The business model I'd developed was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of charging management fees that eroded client returns over time, Williams Property Group operated on a profit-sharing basis that aligned my interests with my clients' success. When their investments generated returns, everyone benefited proportionally. When markets were challenging, we all shared the risks equally. This approach had attracted women who'd been exploited by traditional financial advisors who prioritized their own commissions over their clients' well-being. My personal real estate portfolio had expanded to include 12 properties across Chicago's most promising neighborhoods, from renovated brownstones in Wicker Park to modern condominiums in River North. Each property represented not just financial growth but emotional healing, tangible proof that I'd transformed the wreckage of my marriage into something valuable and lasting. The property that meant the most to me was a small Victorian cottage in Cleveland's University Circle neighborhood, just 6 blocks from where Mom had raised me after Dad abandoned us. I'd bought the house 18 months after her funeral and had spent weekends over the past year renovating it into a retreat where I could work on writing projects and reconnect with the values Mom had instilled in me during those years when it was just the two of us against the world. The Cleveland house had become my sanctuary for processing everything that had happened since that terrible night when I'd returned from Mom's funeral to find Jessica in my bed. The guest room where I worked overlooked the elementary school playground where Mom used to take me when I was young, and sometimes during quiet afternoons I could hear children laughing and playing games that reminded me of the simple happiness I'd felt during those years before I'd learned that the people you love most can also hurt you most deeply. Writing had become an unexpected passion during my recovery from David's betrayal. What had started as journaling recommended by my therapist had evolved into a manuscript about financial fraud in marriage that had attracted interest from several publishers. The book, tentatively titled Hidden Assets: A Woman's Guide to Surviving Financial Betrayal, combined practical advice about protecting wealth with personal stories from clients who'd given permission to share their experiences anonymously. The therapeutic value of writing about financial abuse extended beyond my own healing. Research for the book had connected me with attorneys, investigators, and advocates across the country who were documenting the epidemic of economic abuse that remained largely invisible to lawmakers and social service providers. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, financial abuse occurred in 99% of domestic violence cases, but most victims never received the specialized legal and financial assistance they needed to rebuild their lives. My work with Williams Property Group had attracted attention from journalists, researchers, and policy advocates who were beginning to recognize financial abuse as a distinct form of domestic violence that required specialized responses. I'd been invited to testify before the Illinois State Legislature about proposed reforms to divorce laws that would provide better protections for victims of marital fraud. I'd also consulted with federal investigators about patterns of financial crimes that suggested coordinated schemes to help wealthy men hide assets from their wives. The most satisfying aspect of my advocacy work was collaborating with other survivors who transformed their experiences with betrayal into professional missions to help others. Rebecca Chen, a former tech executive whose venture capitalist husband had stolen her startup ideas and investor relationships, had founded a nonprofit organization that provided legal assistance to women pursuing financial fraud claims. Angela Rodriguez, a doctor whose surgeon husband had hidden millions in offshore accounts, had created an online platform where survivors could share resources and support each other through recovery. Together, we'd formed an informal network of women who understood that surviving financial betrayal required more than just legal remedies or therapeutic support. It required fundamental changes to economic systems that allowed sophisticated criminals to exploit their intimate relationships for financial gain, while facing minimal consequences for their actions. The anniversary of Mom's death arrived during a week when Chicago was experiencing an unusually warm February thaw that reminded everyone that winter wouldn't last forever. I'd planned to spend the day quietly, visiting her grave in Cleveland and reflecting on how much my life had changed since that terrible period when I'd been simultaneously grieving her loss and discovering David's betrayal. Instead, I found myself standing before a packed auditorium at Northwestern's business school, delivering the keynote address for their annual entrepreneurship conference. The speech I'd prepared focused on transforming adversity into opportunity, but as I looked out at an audience filled with young women who reminded me of myself at their age, I decided to speak more personally about the lessons I'd learned from losing everything and choosing to rebuild rather than retreat. 2 years ago, I thought success meant maintaining the perfect marriage, the perfect house, and the perfect business partnership I began. I measured my worth by how well I supported someone else's dreams and how smoothly I could manage other people's expectations. When that perfect life was revealed to be built on lies and theft, I had two choices: accept defeat or create something better from the wreckage. The audience was completely silent as I described the night I'd returned from Mom's funeral to find Jessica in my bed, though I was careful not to sensationalize the betrayal or present myself as a victim seeking sympathy. Instead, I focused on the strategic decisions I'd made to document David's crimes, protect my legal interests, and transform my knowledge of real estate into a business that served other survivors. The most important lesson I learned, I concluded, is that your response to betrayal defines your character more than the betrayal itself. You can allow other people's actions to destroy your faith in yourself, Or you can use their underestimation of your strength as motivation to prove them wrong in the most spectacular way possible. The standing ovation that followed lasted several minutes, but what moved me most was the line of students who waited afterward to ask questions about starting businesses that combined profit with social impact. Several young women shared stories about their own experiences with financial abuse, either personally or through family members, and wanted advice about careers in advocacy or victim services. One student, a junior majoring in finance and psychology, asked whether I'd ever considered expanding Williams Property Group to serve clients nationally rather than just regionally. There are women in every state who need the kind of specialized services you provide, she pointed out. Have you thought about franchising your model or creating online programs that could reach more people? The suggestion sparked ideas that kept me awake that night, sketching plans for a national network of financial advisors who specialized in helping women recover from economic abuse. The model could combine online education programs with local service providers who understood regional legal and economic conditions. Technology could make specialized expertise accessible to women in rural areas or small towns, where traditional financial services were limited. Within 6 months, Williams Property Group had launched its national expansion with pilot programs in Denver, Milwaukee, and Atlanta. Rebecca offered to oversee the Colorado operation, bringing her technology expertise and nonprofit connections to the venture. Angela agreed to develop the medical professional outreach program, recognizing that women in healthcare faced unique vulnerabilities to financial exploitation by spouses who understood their earning potential and professional obligations. The expansion required significant capital investment, but my personal real estate portfolio had appreciated enough to provide the necessary funding without requiring outside investors who might try to influence the company's mission or profit-sharing structure. Independence had become more valuable to me than rapid growth, and I was determined to maintain control over the business principles that distinguished Williams Property Group from traditional financial services firms. By the end of my 3rd year as an entrepreneur, the company was managing investments for over 200 clients across 7 states, with plans to expand into Texas, Florida, and California within the following year. The success had attracted acquisition offers from several major financial services companies, but I declined them all after realizing that corporate ownership would inevitably compromise our specialized focus on serving abuse survivors. David's parole hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in March, 18 months after his sentencing. His attorneys had filed paperwork requesting early release based on good behavior and completion of financial management courses, and victims were invited to provide impact statements that would be considered during the review process. I debated whether to attend the hearing or submit a written statement, ultimately deciding that facing David directly would provide closure that written communication couldn't accomplish. Martha Chen had offered to accompany me, but I'd chosen to handle the confrontation alone as a demonstration of the independence I'd achieved during his incarceration. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago felt familiar now, after multiple appearances during David's criminal proceedings and various civil matters related to asset recovery. The parole hearing was conducted in a smaller room than the courtroom where David had been sentenced, with a 3-member panel of officials who reviewed his institutional record and considered input from victims and family members. David looked older and considerably less confident than he had during our marriage, wearing an orange jumpsuit that emphasized how completely his circumstances had changed since the days when he'd worn custom suits and expensive watches. When our eyes met across the hearing room, I saw recognition but no remorse, calculation but no shame. Prison had changed his appearance but not his fundamental character. The parole officer who presented David's case emphasized his completion of vocational training programs and his lack of disciplinary incidents during incarceration. David's attorney argued that his client had taken responsibility for his actions and was prepared to rebuild his life as a productive citizen who understood the consequences of his past mistakes. When invited to address the panel, David spoke in the same measured tone he'd used during our marriage when he wanted to convince me to see things his way. "I accept full responsibility for the choices that led to my conviction," he said. "I've used my time in prison to reflect on the pain I caused my victims and to develop skills that will help me contribute positively to society upon my release." The words sounded rehearsed and hollow, lacking any genuine acknowledgement of the emotional devastation he'd caused, or understanding of why his actions had been fundamentally wrong beyond their legal consequences. David was performing remorse rather than experiencing it, trying to manipulate the parole board the same way he'd once manipulated me. When asked to provide my victim impact statement, I stood and addressed the panel with the same calm confidence I'd developed during years of business presentations and client consultations. David Rodriguez didn't just steal money from me, I began. He stole my trust, my sense of security, and 2 years of my life that I spent believing our marriage was something worth preserving. He violated his commitment to our relationship while systematically looting our joint assets to fund a parallel life with another woman. I paused, looking directly at David, who was studying his hands rather than meeting my gaze. What concerns me about his request for early parole is that I've seen no evidence he understands why his actions were wrong, beyond the fact that they resulted in criminal charges. His statement today focuses on accepting responsibility and contributing to society, but it doesn't acknowledge the fundamental betrayal of trust that enabled his crimes. The panel members asked whether I believe David posed a continued threat to public safety, or specifically to me personally. I don't fear David physically, I replied, but I believe he remains fundamentally dishonest and manipulative. He's learned to say the right words to convince authority figures that he's changed, but nothing in his presentation today suggests genuine remorse or insight into the emotional damage he caused. David's parole was denied, with the panel citing concerns about his understanding of victim impact and the sophistication of his criminal schemes. He would serve his full sentence, plus the additional 6 months that had been added for violating pretrial release conditions, when he'd attempted to transfer assets to Jessica's accounts after his initial arrest. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt a profound sense of completion rather than vindication. David's fate was no longer relevant to my life or my happiness. He'd become a cautionary tale I sometimes shared with clients about the importance of protecting themselves legally and financially. But he was no longer the defining experience of my adulthood. 6 months later, Williams Property Group celebrated its 5th anniversary with a reception in the ballroom of Chicago's Peninsula Hotel, attended by clients, staff members, and professional partners who'd supported the company's growth into a national organization. The event raised over $200,000 for scholarships that would help women pursue education in finance, real estate, and business management. During my remarks that evening, I thanked the audience for supporting a business model that prioritized client success over short-term profits and social impact over traditional growth metrics. 5 years ago, I learned that the most important investment you can make is in your own independence, I said. Tonight, we celebrate a company that exists to help other women make that same investment in themselves. The photograph from that evening that I keep framed in my Cleveland house shows me surrounded by dozens of women whose lives had been transformed by their decision to refuse victimhood and choose empowerment instead. Maria Santos was there, along with Rebecca Chen and Angela Rodriguez, plus dozens of other survivors who'd become friends, colleagues, and partners in building something meaningful from the ashes of their destroyed relationships. Looking at that photograph now, I'm struck by how different these women look from the frightened, devastated individuals who'd first walked into my office seeking help with financial recovery. Success had given them confidence, independence had restored their dignity, and community had healed wounds that money alone couldn't address. The woman in the center of that photograph, smiling with genuine happiness rather than the forced cheerfulness I'd maintained during my marriage, was someone Mom would have been proud to know. Someone who'd learned that survival wasn't enough if it didn't lead to growth, and that growth without purpose was just another form of emptiness. 10 years after that terrible night when I'd come home from Mom's funeral to find Jessica in my bed, I can honestly say that David's betrayal was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to discover strength I didn't know I possessed, to build a business that aligned with my values, and to create a life based on authentic relationships rather than convenient arrangements. The Victorian cottage in Cleveland where I'm writing these final words overlooks the playground where Mom used to push me on swings during those years when it was just the two of us figuring out how to build a life together. Sometimes I imagine what she'd think about the woman I became after losing everything I thought mattered. I think she'd be proud that I chose to help other women rather than retreating into bitterness, and that I learned to measure success by impact rather than accumulation. David Rodriguez taught me that the people closest to you can inflict the deepest wounds, but he also taught me that surviving betrayal could become the foundation for building something beautiful. The business I created from the wreckage of my marriage has helped hundreds of women discover their own strength and independence. The book I'm finishing will reach thousands more who need to know that financial abuse doesn't have to define their future. Most importantly, I've learned that the best revenge against people who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong once. It's building a life so successful and meaningful that their opinion becomes irrelevant to your happiness. David spent 18 months in prison for his crimes against me, but I've spent the last decade building something that will outlast both our lifetimes and benefit generations of women who refuse to accept victimhood as their permanent identity. The sun is setting over Lake Erie as I finish writing, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that remind me of autumn afternoons, when Mom and I would walk through University Circle discussing my dreams for the future. Those dreams were smaller then, focused on personal happiness and professional success within conventional definitions. The dreams I'm pursuing now are bigger, focused on systemic change and social impact that extend far beyond my own life. Tomorrow morning, I'll return to Chicago and continue building Williams Property Group into the national organization it's becoming. Next month, I'll testify before Congress about proposed legislation to strengthen protections for victims of financial abuse. Next year, I'll open my 20th office and celebrate helping my 1,000th client achieve financial independence. But tonight, in the house where I've learned to be alone without being lonely, I'm simply grateful for the journey that began with devastating betrayal and led to purposeful success. David Rodriguez thought he was destroying my life when he moved his mistress into our house while I grieved my mother. Instead, he was giving me the greatest gift imaginable, the motivation to discover who I really was when everything I thought I needed was taken away. The woman who emerged from that destruction was stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than the woman who'd been betrayed. She was someone Mom would have been proud to call her daughter, and someone I'm proud to have become. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late spring, 15 years after that devastating night when I'd returned from Mom's funeral to discover David's ultimate betrayal. I was sitting in my home office in the Cleveland cottage, reviewing manuscript edits for my third book, when the postman delivered an envelope addressed in handwriting I didn't immediately recognize. The return address showed a women's correctional facility in Wisconsin, and inside was a 3-page letter written on standard prison stationery. "Dear Ms. Williams," it began. "You don't know me, but my name is Rachel Martinez, and I'm writing from Taichita Correctional Institution, where I'm serving a sentence for embezzlement. I read your book Hidden Assets in our prison library, and your story gave me hope during the darkest period of my life. I wanted you to know that your words reached someone who desperately needed to hear them." Rachel's letter went on to describe how she discovered her husband's financial crimes too late to protect herself legally, but early enough to gather evidence that had helped prosecutors convict him of defrauding multiple clients through his accounting firm. She'd been charged as an accomplice because she'd unknowingly signed documents that facilitated his money laundering schemes, and despite cooperating fully with investigators, she'd received a 5-year sentence for her unwitting participation in his criminal enterprise. Reading about how you transformed your experience with betrayal into a mission to help other women has inspired me to think about what I want to do when I'm released next year, Rachel wrote. I've been taking business courses and studying nonprofit management because I want to help women who are facing criminal charges due to their husbands' financial crimes. Too many women are being prosecuted as accomplices when they were actually victims who trusted the wrong person with their financial security. The letter concluded with a request that surprised me in its boldness and humility. Rachel asked whether Williams Property Group might consider hiring formerly incarcerated women who'd been convicted of financial crimes but were actually victims of their partner's manipulation. She'd researched our company extensively and understood that our mission focused on helping women rebuild after financial abuse, but she wasn't sure whether that extended to women who'd served prison sentences for crimes they'd been manipulated into committing. I read Rachel's letter 3 times before setting it aside and walking out to the small garden behind my Cleveland cottage, where I'd planted roses and herbs that reminded me of the plants Mom had tended in our tiny backyard when I was growing up. The afternoon sun was warming the earth after a week of late spring rain, and I could hear children playing in the elementary school playground 6 blocks away, their laughter carrying on the breeze like an echo of my own childhood in this neighborhood. Rachel's letter had arrived at a moment when I'd been considering the next phase of Williams Property Group's evolution. After 15 years of steady growth, the company now operated in 22 states and had helped over 3,000 women achieve financial independence through strategic real estate investments. Our success had generated interest from major financial institutions wanting to acquire us, universities wanting to study our business model, and government agencies wanting to replicate our approaches to serving underserved populations. But success had also created new challenges and responsibilities that sometimes felt overwhelming. Managing a national organization required different skills than providing personalized service to individual clients, and I'd been struggling to maintain the intimate, supportive culture that had originally distinguished Williams Property Group from traditional investment firms. Growth had brought efficiency and reach, but it had also created bureaucratic layers that sometimes interfered with our core mission of helping women heal from financial trauma while building wealth. Rachel's letter reminded me that our work was far from complete, and that there were entire populations of women whose experiences with financial abuse had been complicated by criminal justice involvement that made them ineligible for traditional assistance programs. Women who'd been manipulated into participating in their partner's crimes faced unique barriers to rebuilding their lives, and their stories deserved attention and support that wasn't available through conventional victim services. I spent the rest of that week researching the intersection between financial abuse and criminal justice involvement, discovering that thousands of women were serving sentences for crimes committed by or with their romantic partners. Many had been charged under accomplice liability laws that held them responsible for their partner's actions, even when they'd been coerced, manipulated, or threatened into participation. Others had been prosecuted for failing to report crimes they'd discovered, despite legitimate fears about the consequences of cooperation. The more I learned about criminalized victims, the more I understood that Rachel's situation was representative of a much larger problem that required systemic solutions rather than individual assistance. Women who'd been convicted of financial crimes faced employment barriers, housing discrimination, and social stigma that made rebuilding their lives exponentially more difficult than the challenges faced by women who'd never been criminally charged. 2 weeks after receiving Rachel's letter, I drove to Taycheedah Correctional Institution to meet her in person. The prison was located in a rural area 2 hours north of Milwaukee, surrounded by farmland and forests that created a deceptively peaceful setting for an institution housing nearly 1,000 women. The visiting room was sterile and uncomfortable, with plastic chairs bolted to tables and vending machines offering overpriced snacks and beverages. Rachel Martinez was smaller than I'd imagined, with graying hair and tired eyes that seemed older than her 43 years. She'd been incarcerated for 4 years and had clearly used that time for education and self-improvement, earning a bachelor's degree in business administration through correspondence courses and completing multiple vocational training programs. "Thank you for coming," Rachel said as we sat across from each other at a bolted-down table. "I wasn't sure you'd be willing to visit someone like me." "Someone like you?" "Someone with a criminal record. Someone who was stupid enough to trust a man who was stealing from his clients." The shame and self-blame in Rachel's voice reminded me of conversations I'd had with hundreds of clients over the years. Women who'd been conditioned to accept responsibility for their partner's actions and to minimize their own victimization. Rachel had been psychologically manipulated just as severely as women who'd never faced criminal charges, but her experience had been complicated by legal consequences that reinforced feelings of guilt and worthlessness. During our 2-hour visit, Rachel shared details about her marriage to Miguel Martinez, a certified public accountant who'd built a successful practice serving small businesses in Milwaukee's Latino community. Miguel had gradually involved Rachel in his business operations, asking her to sign documents and manage client communications, while he focused on financial analysis and tax preparation. Rachel had trusted her husband completely and had been proud to support his professional success. Miguel's criminal schemes had been sophisticated and long-term, involving multiple shell corporations, fake invoices, and complex money laundering operations that had defrauded clients of over $2 million. Rachel had unknowingly signed incorporation papers for the shell companies and had deposited fraudulent checks into business accounts, actions that prosecutors had used to charge her as a co-conspirator, despite clear evidence that she'd been unaware of the criminal nature of these activities. The prosecutor told my lawyer that ignorance wasn't a defense, Rachel explained. He said that if I was smart enough to help run a business, I was smart enough to know when something was illegal. But Miguel controlled all the financial information. He told me we were helping clients minimize their tax obligations through legitimate business structures. Rachel's story illustrated the impossible position faced by many women who'd been criminally charged for their partner's financial crimes. Prosecutors expected them to have questioned their husband's business practices and to have recognized complex financial schemes, while defense attorneys struggled to explain their clients' genuine ignorance without portraying them as incompetent or naive. The criminal justice system seemed designed to punish women for trusting their partners, rather than recognizing that this trust had been exploited through sophisticated psychological manipulation. Women like Rachel were serving prison sentences not because they were criminals, but because they'd been effective victims who'd been successfully deceived by men they'd loved and trusted. When I returned to Chicago after meeting Rachel, I immediately scheduled meetings with Martha Chen and several other attorneys who specialized in criminal defense and post-conviction advocacy. I wanted to understand whether Williams Property Group could legally employ women with criminal records and what kinds of support services would be most beneficial for formerly incarcerated women attempting to rebuild their lives. Martha's research confirmed that hiring formerly incarcerated individuals was not only legal, but could qualify Williams Property Group for federal tax incentives designed to encourage employment opportunities for people with criminal records. More importantly, she identified several successful programs that had demonstrated the effectiveness of providing comprehensive support services, including housing assistance, mental health counseling, and financial literacy education for women re-entering society after incarceration. The recidivism rate for women who receive comprehensive re-entry support is less than 10%, Martha explained during one of our planning meetings. But most formerly incarcerated women don't have access to programs that address their specific needs, especially women who've been victimized by intimate partners. Over the following months, I developed a partnership with the Wisconsin Department of Corrections to create a pilot re-entry program specifically designed for women who'd been convicted of financial crimes related to intimate partner abuse. The program combined job training, financial education, and trauma-informed counseling with guaranteed employment opportunities at Williams Property Group offices in Milwaukee and Madison. Rachel Martinez became the first participant in what we called the Second Chances Initiative, beginning work as a client services coordinator 6 months before her scheduled release date through a work release program that allowed her to live in a transitional housing facility while working full-time. Her knowledge of accounting principles and her personal experience with financial victimization made her uniquely qualified to help other women understand their rights and options when dealing with complex financial situations. Working with Sarah has given me something I thought I'd lost forever, Rachel told a reporter from Milwaukee Magazine who was writing about innovative reentry programs. She's given me the chance to transform my experience with betrayal into something that helps other women avoid the mistakes I made. The Second Chances Initiative expanded rapidly as word spread through correctional facilities and legal advocacy organizations about employment opportunities for formerly incarcerated women. Within 2 years, Williams Property Group was employing 43 women with criminal records across 8 states, and their success had inspired similar programs at other companies committed to social justice hiring practices. The formerly incarcerated employees brought unique perspectives and skills to their work with clients. They understood financial manipulation from personal experience, they recognized warning signs that other staff members might miss, and they provided hope and inspiration for clients who felt hopeless about their situations. Many had completed college degrees while incarcerated and had used their time in prison for reflection and personal growth that made them exceptionally committed employees. Rachel's success led to her promotion to regional director of the Milwaukee office, where she supervised a team of 12 employees and managed investments for over 200 clients. Her story was featured in several national publications as an example of how formerly incarcerated individuals could contribute meaningfully to society when given genuine opportunities for redemption and professional growth. People assume that women who've been convicted of financial crimes can't be trusted with money, Rachel said during a conference presentation about re-entry employment programs. But we understand better than anyone how financial systems can be manipulated and how important it is to protect vulnerable people from economic abuse. Our criminal records don't make us untrustworthy. They make us experts in recognizing financial crimes. The Second Chances initiative also attracted attention from policymakers and researchers interested in criminal justice reform and victim advocacy. I was invited to testify before congressional subcommittees about the intersection between intimate partner violence and criminal justice involvement, and our program was cited in several academic studies about innovative approaches to reducing recidivism and supporting crime survivors. More personally, working with formerly incarcerated women had deepened my understanding of the ways that financial abuse intersected with other forms of systemic oppression. Many of our Second Chances participants were women of color who'd faced additional barriers in the criminal justice system, or immigrants who'd been particularly vulnerable to manipulation by partners who controlled their legal status as well as their finances. Their stories reinforced my conviction that individual success wasn't sufficient if it didn't contribute to broader social change. Williams' Property Group had grown beyond a business into a movement that challenged assumptions about victimhood, criminal responsibility, and the possibility of redemption through meaningful work and community support. 5 years after receiving Rachel's first letter, I was invited to speak at her college graduation ceremony when she completed her master's degree in social work through an online program at the University of Wisconsin. The ceremony was held in the visiting room at Taichida, with family members, program administrators, and fellow inmates celebrating the achievements of 15 women who'd earned degrees while incarcerated. Education gave me tools to understand what happened to me, Rachel said during her valedictorian speech. But Sarah Williams gave me the opportunity to use those tools to help other women transform their lives. The greatest gift anyone can receive is the chance to turn their pain into purpose, and that's what the Second Chances initiative has given to all of us. Sitting in that prison visiting room, surrounded by women who'd survived the worst kinds of betrayal and were now preparing to rebuild their lives with dignity and hope, I thought about the journey that had begun 20 years earlier when I'd returned from Mom's funeral to find Jessica in my bed. That night had felt like the end of everything I'd valued and trusted, but it had actually been the beginning of a mission that had grown far beyond anything I could have imagined. David Rodriguez had intended to destroy my life when he moved his mistress into our house, while I grieved my mother's death. Instead, he'd given me the motivation to discover strengths I didn't know I possessed, and to build something meaningful from the wreckage of our marriage. His betrayal had ultimately benefited thousands of women who'd found hope, healing, and financial independence through Williams' Property Group and its related programs. The woman who'd been devastated by discovering her husband's affair and financial crimes had evolved into someone who understood that personal healing required contributing to systemic change. Individual success felt hollow unless it created opportunities for others to achieve their own transformation and growth. Rachel Martinez had become more than an employee or program participant. She'd become a colleague and friend whose journey reminded me daily that redemption was possible for anyone willing to acknowledge their mistakes and commit to growth. Her success validated the belief that had motivated me through the darkest periods of my own recovery, that the best response to betrayal was building something beautiful that would outlast the pain and benefit people you'd never meet. Walking out of that prison graduation ceremony, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing your work has meaningful impact beyond personal success or financial achievement. Williams' Property Group had grown from my need to rebuild after David's betrayal into a national organization that was changing lives, influencing policy, and challenging assumptions about victimhood and criminal responsibility. The cottage in Cleveland where I'd written my books and processed my healing now served as a retreat center, where formerly incarcerated women could spend time reflecting on their goals and planning their futures after release. The small garden where I'd planted roses had expanded into a therapeutic space, where women could work with their hands, while talking through their experiences and preparing for the challenges of re-entry. Sometimes, sitting in that garden on quiet evenings, I thought about the conversation Mom and I might have had about the woman I'd become after losing everything I'd thought mattered. I believed she would have been proud that I'd chosen compassion over bitterness, that I'd transformed personal pain into a mission that served others, and that I'd learned to measure success by impact rather than accumulation. The best revenge against David Rodriguez hadn't been his prison sentence or his professional ruin, though both had provided a sense of justice. The best revenge had been building a life so meaningful and successful that his opinion had become irrelevant to my happiness. He'd taught me that the people closest to you could inflict devastating wounds. But he'd also taught me that surviving betrayal could become the foundation for extraordinary purpose. 25 years after that terrible night when everything changed, Williams Property Group employed over 300 people across 30 states and had helped more than 10,000 women achieve financial independence. The Second Chances Initiative had provided opportunities for over 200 formerly incarcerated women to rebuild their lives through meaningful work and comprehensive support services. The books I'd written about financial abuse had been translated into 12 languages and had influenced legislation in multiple states. The advocacy work had contributed to policy changes that better protected victims and held perpetrators accountable. The business model had inspired similar organizations, serving other vulnerable populations. But the accomplishment that meant the most was simpler and more personal. I'd learned that the worst thing that ever happened to me had also been the best thing, because it had forced me to discover who I really was when everything I thought I needed was taken away. The woman who emerged from that destruction was stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than the woman who'd been betrayed. She was someone Mom would have been proud to call her daughter, and someone I was proud to have become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.